Welcome to How Ecology Works. In this podcast, we cover all topics in ecology and how you might apply them in your future career. Hey everybody, welcome back to How Ecology Works. Today we're going to talk about how seed dispersal works. And this is a pretty cool topic, something that my lab has started to get involved in and investigate, and it's really fun to work on that system and think about wildlife eating fruits and seeds and carrying those seeds to other places, and then they germinate. You know, this really interesting to think about the ecology of that and how it applies to different systems. And today I have with me soon to be Dr. David Mason,
Hopefully,
who has studied seed dispersal from various points of view for your entire dissertation.
Yep.
So what I wanted to do is kind of immediately pitch you the ball, or we'll say seed.
Okay. I'm ready.
We'll
Got a trap
pitch
right
it
here.
to you right here. And can you tell us just in general, like some of the ecological, I guess, hypotheses that have sort of underpinned what we know about seed dispersal?
Sure. So for a long time, people were sort of describing seed dispersal, the different mechanisms of how it worked and how many seeds a plant produced and things like that. And then around the 60s and 70s, people started thinking of trying to explain it from an evolutionary ecology perspective. Why do seeds disperse? And they came up with three general hypotheses. One, to escape negative density-dependent interactions associated with the parent plant, stuff like increased pathogens or predation or competition.
Okay, so can you break that down? What was that hypothesis called?
That's called the escape hypothesis. The idea is you want to disperse to get away from the parent because there's a lot of danger associated with the parent.
Okay, so you got your parent that's produced the fruit,
Right.
or some sort of
Think
seed.
about like an oak
The idea
masting.
is that from an evolutionary perspective, the seed needs to get farther away from the plant to escape all the pathogens or competition or whatever.
Yeah, if you think about all the oak acorns falling underneath, they're going to be competing with each other and competing with the parent plant. And that's a heck of a spot for a squirrel to come look for acorns, right?
Yeah, so you may be concentrating the predator. Okay, so that's what you mean by negative density dependence.
Right. So another hypothesis was the colonization hypothesis. And the idea here is that plants just sort of broadcast their seeds in every which way with the hopes of randomly landing in a good place to establish, or of remaining at the place where it lands and entering the seed bank and sitting and holding tight until conditions become favorable for establishment.
Okay, so in this strategy, is the plant just producing as many seeds as possible, and they're just kind of randomly getting to different places in the landscape?
Yeah, that's right. You're talking about dedicating what resources you can to producing as many propagule or so many seeds as you can, and just getting them out there.
That's
and
okay to say propagules.
Okay, we can say propagule.
Talking about it, we're talking to ecology students here.
Yeah.
So you can, when you say propagule, you just mean the
offspring of the offspring of a plant, or really just, it's really a broad word that can describe all the different ways that plants can sort of break off from an adult plant and disperse to another one, a new individual.
Reproduction.
Yep, it can be that. There's all sorts of all sorts of ways that plants can disperse that aren't seeds, but that may act sort of like seeds. But typically, we're thinking about seeds as being the offspring of a plant, and that's how it would disperse. But we use this word propagule because it's sort of a grab bag of everything.
I gotcha. So more generally, just like the reproduction of the plant.
Yeah, it's more correct to say.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, so you were talking about the colonization. So they're producing many propagules or seeds.
With the hopes that, you're going to be doing this every year that you're alive as a parent plant, which, for some plants can be quite a long time. You're just hoping some of them will eventually be able to establish, and that will increase your fitness, right?
Right. So the more of them that establish, the better. But really, it's, I guess, still evolutionarily viable.
Yep.
for the plant to produce tons and tons, and only a few randomly end up in a good spot.
Yep.
One thing that makes me think of, and I just want you to speak on it, I think of them being sort of broadcast across the landscape, and when I think random, I'm thinking almost not equally distributed, but sort of uniform in the environment. Is that a good way to think about it?
I guess it could be. I think we're talking sort of random with respect to the type of place it ends up in.
So it has an equal likelihood of ending up in any particular places. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't skewed.
Right. It gets a little bit into what does random mean. I mean, if you go up to a dandelion, right, and you blow on them, it's not random. There's deterministic things happening that are going to determine where each one of those end up.
Like you could blow on it, and a whole bunch of them are probably going to randomly float away, and then they kind of land in clusters, even though it was sort of random.
Right, and the what's going on with the air pressure and how hard you blew, and
so there was some process that determined that they would cluster at the end.
But it may appear sort of random with regards to where.
That would still qualify as the colonization hypothesis.
It could,
When would it not?
Well, if those propagules were arriving in favorable places disproportionately, so more often than you would expect by random chance alone, that would be a third hypothesis. And that's called the directed dispersal hypothesis.
All right. So we have skewed seed rain.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just tell us what seed rain is. I keep using that term without actually letting you define it.
So when we talk about dispersal, we're often talking about the movement of a propagule from a particular, donor or parent plant and how far it gets and where it ends up. When we're talking about from the kind of the flip side, from the destination instead, we think about me with my seed traps that I place out there. I don't necessarily know where they're coming from. I just know that I have this seed trap and there's things arriving.
Yeah.
There's things raining down. That seed rain. It's really in the way you're measuring.
So if you were in an airplane and you just started throwing seeds out, it's literally like they're landing somewhere, and that's sort of like seed rain.
Right. Yeah.
Could be in the clouds, literally.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So back to directed dispersal.
Right.
So you said that there was skewed seed rain, and it's positively skewed towards more favorable sites.
Right. More often than we would expect.
For the seed to germinate and establish?
Yep. And you could sort of take that you could take that as far as you want, depending on how you want to conceptualize it. It could be a place that increases fitness.
Yeah.
It's hard to measure.
Ultimately, that's what we would want to do, but it's just really hard to measure.
Right, you got to follow things for a long time.
Yeah. And I guess the favorable site could be because it has less competition or has more nutrients.
Yep.
Maybe less predators.
Yep. Less herbivory pressure. Could be protection from, could be fire refugia. All kinds of stuff, Anything that confers an advantage.
Yeah. Or in your case, it might be the opposite of a fire
That's
refugia,
true,
which could be a place that burned.
Right. Yep. That's a good point.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Okay. So your work has kind of shed some light on this directed dispersal hypothesis.
Yeah.
I guess maybe tell us a little more about that, and then what your work is adding to it.
Right. So going back to the times when these were sort of being formulated, people were just they were collecting evidence, and they were also trying to logically sort of philosophically think about how seed dispersal works. And they came to the conclusion that directed dispersal should be rare. It should be rare because plants don't know where the favorable spots are. Plants don't have the senses to be able to tell that. And plants can't really, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself with a lot of plants being dispersed by animals. I'm talking about that in particular, but I was just say the first reason should be that it's really hard for plants to predict where that good spot is. So that should be
particularly rare. Because the good site might not be in the same place forever.
Yeah, it's going to move around, so it's going to be
every time one gets colonized, it's no longer the good spot.
Right. Yeah.
Now it's colonized.
Yeah, it's a moving target for sure.
Okay.
But what we've been looking at, in particular with animal seed dispersal. Now, in our lab, we're interested in wildlife. We're interested in habitat, and a lot of the species that animals disperse are good habitat components for wildlife species. So, kind of focused in on those. So, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, moving forward, is animal seed dispersal, and particularly people would think that animal seed dispersal would rarely end up in directed dispersal, because the plant also can't reward the animal for delivering the seed to the good spot. So why would the animal do it? Mm-hmm. If the plant doesn't have some kind of way to gain, the plant can only reward the animal for consuming the fruit.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. After that, the animal's going to go do whatever it wants to do, and the seed's going to end up where it ends up.
Yeah.
So we would only expect it to occur in highly specialized relationships.
If the plant has to actively influence what the animal's doing after consumption.
Right.
It would have to have some sort of specialized adaptation to do so.
Yeah, and the more classic example that we've sort of talked about a lot is with mistletoe. Mistletoe is a parasitic plant that grows in trees. You may see it in the winter, sort of when all the other foliage is gone. You can see it up there like a little bush up inside the tree. And that plant produces fruit that has a sticky substance in it called viscin. And when a bird or an animal in general consumes mistletoe, when it's on its way out, or when it's on its way in as well, it gets stuck to the animal, and the animal needs to dislodge it. And it typically does that, or it can do that, by rubbing its body on a twig that is the right size for a mistletoe seed to colonize, and that's how the mistletoe gets where it needs to be.
Okay, so let's break that down. Mistletoe produces this little white fruit that birds like to eat, and particular bird species eat that fruit or try to eat it, and it gets all stuck on them.
Yep.
And it turns out that same substance makes the seed stick really well to the limb that the bird goes and rubs it off on.
Yep. It's a parasitic.
And it's parasitic, so it's
got to stay there to. Yeah, it's got to stay there to get
it germinates and grows into the tree's limb. That's parasitizing rather than it. Okay.
Yeah.
And you could see where that is a very specialized adaptation.
Right.
It's probably serving multiple purposes, but it is a specialized adaptation of mistletoe to cause the animal to go to a particularly sized limb and engage in a behavior to try to remove it that ends up sticking it to the appropriate size limb. So they disproportionately arrive at the favorable microsite, which is the appropriately sized limb, to colonize the new plant. Is that pretty much what you're saying? You
got it. And I would even say that I said it was a specialized relationship. Those were kind of hypothesized at the time. And when they really started looking, they didn't really find very many. There's something like an oil bird is an example of a bird that really eats like one particular kind of fruit, but that's not the norm. Even the mistletoe, I mean, there's arboreal mammals that eat mistletoe. There's a ton of birds that consume mistletoe. It's a specialized adaptation, but I sort of misspoke when I said specialized relationship, because it's really quite another word. What we'll define right here is it's a diffuse relationship. In general, most seed dispersal is.
Okay. What do you mean by diffuse?
It just means that it's a mutualism that there's a lot of participants. We talk about seed dispersal in particular. It means there's a lot of participants on both sides. There's a lot of plants that produce fruit, and there's a lot of animals that consume fruit. And they're all sort of participating in the mutualism together.
Okay. So
mistletoe has a specialized adaptation.
Right, that causes birds to engage in a behavior that results in depositing the seed disproportionately in a favorable site.
Right, and so researchers, think that this is sort of the type of relationship that directed dispersal is isolated to. And there's a couple other examples we could go through as well, but for a long time that's where we see directed dispersal.
Okay. So that's literally only. I mean, there can't be that many examples of stuff like that, right? I mean, how many?
where we have the active component?
Well, just, like where the plant has some sort of specialized adaptation that's causing
not
seeds
too
to
many.
arrive into.
We've thought of a couple other potential pathways by which it could occur. Plants can control how long seeds stay in the gut of animals with different chemicals, things like that.
And you were telling me one about the fruit is really dry, which seems kind of weird.
Yeah,
but it makes the animal thirsty, so the animal goes to drink after it eats the seeds,
right?
And then they end up near water.
That's an observation from a book chapter, not
not an experimentally tested.
Right. So that's kind of where we're digging around to find examples. If that gives you kind of a hint of.
Okay. So basically the active form where the plant has some sort of adaptation that's actively causing the animal to engage in behavior is probably pretty rare. At least it's been rarely observed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, what is the alternative?
The alternative is a passive form of directed dispersal, or passive directed dispersal, in which the plant doesn't play any role in dictating where the propagule ends up beyond just getting consumed or attaching to the animal. In other words, the animal's behavior, what it was going to do anyways, is going to end up delivering the propagule to a favorable location. And if that was all you needed for directed dispersal to occur, we're talking about opening up a whole world of potential examples.
Okay. So can you give me some examples and explain why it opens up possibilities so much?
Sure. So I'm working with fire. Fire produces a resource pulse that attracts animals. A lot of those animals disperse seeds. It's also it can be a favorable location for plants to establish. So the animals are consuming fruit or getting fruit attached to them on the landscape. We have a burn happen. It's a resource pulse. The animals want to go there. They're going to go there. So
they're tracking this resource tracking, which is a common phenomenon in nature. We know that animals track resources.
And in the process of tracking and using those resources, they're depositing propagules at the recently burned area. Now that example alone is it involves a ton of ecosystems and a ton of just
a large
the total
portion
area
of the terrestrial landscape is
yeah.
flammable and on the planet. So.
Right. And a lot of animals are attracted to fire, and a lot of those plants can benefit from being dispersed there. So you're already opening up.
And a large portion of the plants are animal dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that could be really common, just that one example.
Right. If that example alone would already kind of close the book on whether or not directed dispersal is rare.
Right.
It's not going to be rare if that's
true.
Right.
Which is where your work is headed. And you have pretty strong evidence from several things that's likely.
Yep. Another common resource pulse that animals resource track is carrion. And there's been some evidence documenting
that they're carrying like a dead animal.
Like a dead animal, yeah. You get all this energy and nutrients bound up in a living organism. And when that organism perishes, which all organisms will eventually, all that nutrients and energy is now up for the taking. And a whole suite of organisms, some specialized, others more generalist, are going to come visit that carrion.
Yeah, so you have facultative scavengers.
Yep.
So in other words, they eat carrion for part of the meal, their diet when it's available, but they eat other stuff like seeds.
Yep.
Okay.
They're going to be coming and consuming that carrion or consuming other things consuming the carrion, and they're going to be depositing propagules at the carrion. Now, this is again very similar to the fire example in that simultaneously to be in a resource pulse, it's also preparing
the seed bed.
Yep, for newly arriving plants, making it a favorable location. It's doing that because the carrion itself, just by the fact that, if you think about something like a dead pig carcass, it's laying on top of the vegetation. It's going to kill the plants directly under it. It's going to leach a bunch of nutrients into the soil, which is toxic at first, but then wanes and is no longer toxic.
And becomes a really nutrient-rich place with no competition.
Exactly. So that's that's nature's way of going out there and making it about as favorable as it could be for a newly arriving plant, and that this has been demonstrated.
That's really cool.
Yep. Those are two common right off the bat. That's fire and death. I mean,
those are both really common.
Yep.
Sometimes they're coupled.
Yeah, for sure. Australia.
Yeah. Okay. So, but the passive directed dispersal, that's being coined in a paper that you led.
Yeah.
Where, why did you do that? Like what is transforming that idea? Like, why is it important?
It's important because it changes the way we think about how seed dispersal works, and particularly how animal seed dispersal works, how the system works, and how communities organize themselves, I guess. I mean, it's important because it's changing the way we think about it. I mean, we for a long time we've been thinking that directed dispersal was really rare, and
because it was really kind of suggesting that there had to be this active role of the plant in dictating how the seeds got to a favorable site.
Right.
So because of that, it's kind of considered pretty broadly as being rare.
Right.
And that makes sense because indeed, even when you were talking about looking for examples of that specialized adaptation that actually causes some behavioral response in the vector that does that, probably is pretty rare.
Yeah.
But by opening the door to this idea that the plant doesn't actually need to dictate what the animal does, it just needs to take advantage of what the animal's doing when it's favorable.
Yeah.
Now all it has to do is get the animal to eat it or attach it to itself.
Right. So it could include many more plants and animals than previously expected. And
potentially the majority of them.
Right. And we went through in that paper and found 13, 14 different examples. And
like systems where we think it'd be really commonly happening in, and reasons why it probably fits that. But one thing that I just want to make clear, and I think that you've done a good job at characterizing all of this, but the passive so it isn't just getting the animal. It doesn't happen just because it got the animal to eat it. It's specifically when the animal has some sort of behavioral syndrome that is favorable for the plant also.
Right.
So in other words, like if a bird nests somewhere and it's going to go back to that nest all the time, if that nest happens to be a really awesome place to establish for a seed that it's eating, then that would result in passive directed dispersal because the bird went out and ate some fruit and it's just going back to its nest because that's where it goes.
Yeah.
And the seed engaged in passive directed dispersal from that plant because it took advantage of the fact that the bird was going to go to the nest that happens to be a favorable site. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, I think this is a really good introduction to seed dispersal and what that contribution does. I think you've done a really great job in the manuscript and characterizing that. And I just wanted the audience to know if you're interested in reading more about that, or really getting into the weeds about this and understanding the different places where it might happen and how impactful that might be. Some theoretical
we didn't
underpinning
even get into gravity. All things underpinned by gravity.
A modeling framework that predicts it really well that we've utilized in that paper. So really cool stuff. We'll put the link to the paper in the show notes so that anybody that's interested can have ready access to it.
If they have any questions,
we'll put your handle in there for social media. And they can reach out to you and ask questions if they have them.
Cool.
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome.
Appreciate it. See y'all later. Thanks for listening to How Ecology Works. If you're interested in more topics like this, follow us at ufdeerlab.